Commander Lyria Stormweaver stood near the large window of the space station and watched the red sun shine on the planet below her feet and the world. Called Curvac 7 turned slowly in the darkness of space, and its surface looked angry with storms and volcanoes and wild jungles that could kill anyone who tried to live there, and the Galactic Council had marked this world as Class 9, which meant it was too dangerous for anyone to survive on it. And no sane person would go there without a very good reason. Her silver hair moved in the air from the station vents, and she wore the white armor of a commander, and her pointed ears marked her as one of the ancient elf people who had traveled the stars for thousands of years. And beside her in the corner of the observation deck lay her dragon companion Thornax, and his black scales shined like stars, and his orange eyes watched everything with the focus of a hunter, and he was 15 meters long from his nose to the tip of his tail, and though he was small for a dragon, he was fierce and smart and loyal. The second officer walked up to her and said the human transport ship had just entered the atmosphere of the planet, and his voice sounded worried because he knew what was down. Baron Lyria had seen many different species try to survive on dangerous worlds, but none had ever picked a Class 9 world for training, and it seemed like madness to her. She touched the control panel, and the screens showed her 20 human cadets from the Terran Defense Academy falling toward the planet in small drop pods, and their mission was simple but deadly, and they had to survive for 10 standard days and travel 300 kilometers to reach the pickup point, and this was the same challenge that had killed many of her own people during the first contact wars before the peace treaty was signed, and Lyria had lost friends on worlds like this. What bothered her most was not the difficulty of the challenge, but the sounds she heard on the communication channels between the human pods, and one of them, named Maya Bennett, was shouting that she wanted to catch the biggest fish, and another voice belonged to Sophie Martinez, who yelled that the last person to reach camp had to buy drinks for everyone, and they were laughing as their pods shook and burned through the hostile atmosphere. Thornax lifted his huge head, and smoke came from his nose holes, and through the mental bond they shared, Lyria felt his confusion, because the humans sounded happy and excited instead of scared, and she whispered in the old elf language that they did not understand what was waiting for them down there. And her fingers drummed on the window as she watched. The Galactic Council had given her an important job, and she had to watch these humans and decide if they were worthy to join the Sentinel program, which was an elite group of warriors who protected weak species and patrolled the most dangerous parts of space and fought against the darkness between the stars. And if these cadets died on Curvac 7, then humanity would be banned from the stars for another 100 years, and that would be ashamed. If they succeeded, then Lyria was not sure what that would mean for the galaxy, because humans were strange and unpredictable and different from any species she had studied before the first pods hit the surface of the planet and disappeared into the toxic jungle canopy where the trees had thorns and the plants ate meat and the air was thick with poison, and emergency beacons activated automatically as they were programmed to do. But instead of hearing distress calls and cries for help, Lyria heard excited whoops and cheers, and someone named Lauren Hayes was already talking about the interesting plants she could see. Lyria told her lieutenant to prepare her personal shuttle and get the special harness ready for Thornax, because she needed to see this with her own eyes, and the lieutenant asked if she was planning to go down to the surface, and she interrupted him and said to just watch the humans, because something was different about them, and she needed to understand what it wasn't. The planet's surface far below Maya Bennett climbed out of her pod and looked around at the carnivorous plants that tried to grab her, and the acid-spitting insects that were as big as her head, and she heard the distant roar of some creature that definitely wanted to eat her, and instead of being scared, she smiled wide and slung her pack over her shoulder and checked her compass and said this was the best field trip ever. War for survival had started, but nobody had told the humans that it was supposed to be a war, and they treated it like an adventure instead. Lyria watched the video feeds from the orbital satellites and saw all 20 humans moving through the jungle with confidence. And they were not panicking or calling for help, and they were working together and setting up camps and exploring the area and treating the deadly environment like it was normal and she had never seen. anything like this before in all her centuries of life. Sophie Martinez found a stream and tested the water and discovered it was safe to drink. If they boiled it first, and she set up a filtration system using materials from her pod and some local rocks, and Maya Bennett was tracking animal prints in the mud and trying to figure out what was safe to hunt and what would hunt them instead. Riley Thompson, who was good with technology, managed to boost their communication range by building a relay system using spare parts, and now all 20 humans could talk to each other across several kilometers, and they were sharing information and helping each other survive. And Lyria saw this and realized they were stronger together than apart. Lauren Hayes was the science expert, and she was cataloging every plant and animal and insect she found and taking samples and running tests, and she discovered which plants were poisonous and which ones could be used for medicine. And she even found some that could be eaten, and she shared all this information with her team. Amber Collins was the hunter, and she moved through the jungle like a shadow, and she understood how predators thought, and she found tracks of a large creature and followed them carefully, and she was patient and smart and did not take unnecessary risks. And when she returned to camp that evening, she had caught 3 strange rabbit-like creatures that the team cooked for dinner. Brooklyn Wells was fascinated by the storms, and she set up weather monitoring equipment and studied the patterns of lightning and rain, and she discovered that the orange lightning was caused by unusual minerals in the atmosphere, and she collected samples to study later, and she was excited. Instead of afraid, Harper Diaz was the team medic, and she checked everyone for injuries and made sure they were drinking enough water and eating enough food, and she created a medical station in their camp using supplies from the pods and her own knowledge, and she treated small cuts and burns and made sure everyone stayed healthy. The humans built their first camp near a cliff that gave them a good view of the surrounding area, and they used materials from their drop pods to make shelters, and they worked together like they had done this 100 times before, and there was no arguing or fighting, and everyone had a job, and they trusted each other. Complete. Lyria watched all of this from her station high above, and she could not believe what she was seeing. And these humans were not just surviving on a Class 9 death the world, but they were thriving, and they were happy, and they were treating it like a normal camping trip. And she had to know. Withornax rumbled in her mind and asked when they could go down and meet these strange humans, and she told him to be patient and they would go soon, but first she needed to understand them better, and she needed to watch more. That night the humans sat around their campfire and told stories and laughed and sang songs, and they were not worried about the dangerous creatures in the jungle or the toxic plants or the acid rain that would come tomorrow, and they were together, and that seemed to be enough for them. Maya Bennett looked up at the stars and saw the space station orbiting above, and she pointed it out to Sophie Martinez, and they both knew someone was watching them, and they waved at the sky like they were greeting a friend. And Lyria saw this on her monitors and felt something strange in her chest. And it might have been respect, or it might have been the beginning of friendship. The commander made a note in her report that humanity was unlike any species she had encountered before, and they did not fear death worlds because they came from one, and they did not panic in dangerous situations because danger was normal for them, and they protected each other with fierce loyalty, and they found joy even in the darkest places. And these were the qualities of true sentinels. Thornax agreed with her through their bond. It said these humans were like dragons in spirit, and they were brave and strong and worthy of respect, and he wanted to meet them soon. Lyria promised him they would go down to the surface tomorrow and make contact with the humans and learn more about them and see if they were really as special as they seemed to be. And she had a feeling that this mission would change everything for both humanity and the galaxy. The first day ended with all 20 humans alive and healthy and laughing, and the death world had not killed them, and Lyria suspected it never would. Commander Lyria sat in her shuttle as it cut through the thick atmosphere of Curvac 7. Like a knife, and Thornax was secured in the back compartment, and she could feel his excitement through their mental bond. And the dragon had never met humans before, and he was curious about these strange creatures who smelled like iron and determination. According to the scanning equipment, she had been watching the cadets for 3 full days, and everything she witnessed went against what she knew about survival on death worlds, and the orbital sensors showed all 20 humans not only alive, but doing well in conditions that should have killed them within hours, and she needed to see this for herself. Up close, her shuttle descended toward a high ridge that overlooked the human camp, which they had named Base Camp Charlie for some reason, and through the enhanced optics on her ship. Lyria looked down and saw something that made her blood turn cold with fear. Maya, Bennett, and Sophie. Martinez had built a shelter using pieces from their drop pods and local plant materials, and that was normal and expected, but what terrified Lyria was that they had built it right next to a nest of curvax serpents, and these were apex predators. On this planet, and they grew 3 meters long, and their venom was so strong it could melt through armor plating, and most soldiers would run away from these creatures. Lyria whispered that the humans were going to die, and she watched as the serpents came out of their nest for their evening hunt, and she reached for the emergency extraction controls, but then Lauren Hayes stepped forward with her datapad in hand, and she calmly scanned the serpents while staying just outside their strike range. And she announced to the other humans that 6 meters was the serpents' comfort zone, and if they did not cross the small creek, then they would be fine. And she added that the serpents were actually kind of cute when they were sunbathing. Lyria could not believe what she was hearing, and she said the word cute in disbelief because nothing about those deadly serpents was cute. Thornax rumbled with amusement in her mind and told her that the small humans were fearless. The next shock came when Amber Collins returned to camp carrying something that made Lyria and her tactical officer curse in 3 different languages, and was a razor spine boar which weighed 200 kilograms and was covered in armored plates and spines, and it was one of the most aggressive creatures on the planet, and most military squads avoided fighting these things without heavy weapons. Announced that she brought dinner and dropped the dead creature near the fire pit, and Riley Thompson immediately started preparing cooking equipment. Like this was a normal thing. Sophie asked how Amber killed such a dangerous animal, and Amber shrugged and explained that she tracked it to a watering hole and used the terrain to funnel it toward a cliff face, and then dropped a large boulder on it when it charged at her, and she said it was the same principle as hunting mountain lions back home. Just bigger. Lyria pulled up the Earth's wildlife database on her computer and read about mountain lions, and they were apex predators on the human homeworld, and humans hunted them for recreation and sport, and she said by the stars. Under her breath, Thornax asked through their bond if the young humans planned to fight, and Lyria corrected him and said they were not young or weak, and they were something else entirely. The next day brought a massive storm that would have sent Lyria and her troops running for emergency shelters, and the wind speeds went over 200 kilometers per hour, and the rain was acidic enough to burn exposed skin, and the humans simply put on their weatherproof gear and reinforced their camp with extra tie-downs, and one of them named Brooklyn Wells actually went outside to collect samples of the orange lightning because she thought it was cool. Thornax shifted restlessly in the shuttle and told Lyria that he wanted to meet these humans, and she replied absolutely not, because they were there to observe only. But observation became impossible on day 5 when disaster finally happened. Sophie Martinez had been scouting ahead of the main group when the ground suddenly gave way beneath her feet, and she fell into a cave system, and the sensors identified it as a nest for shadow moths, which were nocturnal hunters with electromagnetic detection, and they could track prey by sensing their heartbeat alone, and 3 of the creatures were already moving toward Sophia. Lyria reached for the emergency extraction controls because she had to save the young human before she died, but then the other humans reacted faster than Lyria could move. Maya Bennett grabbed a rope and rappelled into the dark cave without any hesitation, and she carried improvised flares made from fuel cells, and she shouted for Sophie to follow her voice. Harper Diaz grabbed a metal pipe from the salvage pile and yelled that Sophie was not going to die in a hole, and she jumped into the cave. To within minutes, 6 humans had descended into certain death to retrieve their fallen friend, and Lyria watched in horror as the shadow moths closed in on them and their eyeless heads swiveled toward the human heartbeats. Then Maya did something unprecedented, and she threw a flare directly at the nearest shadow moth while screaming at the top of her lungs, and the creature, which relied on electromagnetic senses and sound, was overwhelmed by the sudden burst of light and heat and noise, and it recoiled in confusion. Lauren shouted from above that the shadow maws relied on electromagnetism and sound to hunt, and if they overloaded their senses, the creatures would retreat. Humans created a symphony of chaos, and they banged metal pipes together and threw more flares and even played loud music from someone's personal device, and the shadow maws, with their sophisticated hunting senses completely overwhelmed, retreated deeper into the tunnels to escape the noise. Sophie emerged from the cave bruised and with a twisted ankle but alive and grinning, and she asked if anyone got footage of what just happened. Ilaria sat back in her pilot chair, and her hands were trembling, and her people would have mourned the dead and retreated from such a place. But these humans had turned a rescue mission into a victory through sheer audacity. An improvisation and thinking fast. Thornax's presence filled her mind, and it was warm with respect, and he told her that he was wrong to doubt the humans, and they were predators who protected their pack, just like dragons did. Illyria said they were. More than that, and she pulled up the mission logs on her computer, and she said they were something the galaxy had never seen before. She opened a secure communication channel to the Galactic Council headquarters and identified herself as commander. Stormweaver and said she needed to revise her initial assessment of the human candidates, and she paused and watched as the humans celebrated Sophie's survival with hugs and laughter, and she requested permission to make direct contact with them. Response came back quickly and said permission was granted. But observe extreme caution because the council still did not fully understand humans and what made them differently. Looked at Thornax and asked if he was ready to meet their new allies. Dragon teeth gleamed in what might have been a smile, and he said finally through their bond that evening, Lyria prepared her personal armor and checked her ceremonial blade and made sure everything was perfect because first impressions mattered. And she wanted the humans to understand that she respected them, and Thornax was excited and kept shifting in the cargo bay and asking when they would go. She told him to be patient for just a little longer, and they would descend at sunset, when the humans were gathered around their campfire, and that would be the most dramatic time to Aravelleria reviewed all the data she had collected over the past 5 days, and she saw patterns that amazed her, and the humans worked together with perfect coordination, and they trusted each other completely, and they adapted to new threats in seconds, and they found creative solutions to impossible problems, and they never gave up. No matter how bad things looked, she made notes in her report about their teamwork and their resilience and their optimism and their ability to turn survival into an adventure, and these were exactly the qualities needed for the Sentinel. Corpse Thornax asked if she thought the Galactic Council would approve humanity for the program, and Lyria said she would personally recommend it, and she would stake her reputation on these humans. The dragon was pleased and said that he looked forward to fighting alongside humans in the future as the sun began to set over Curvax 7. Painting the toxic sky in shades of purple and orange, Lyria started her shuttle engines and began the descent toward base camp. Charlie and her heart beat faster with anticipation and nervousness, and she wondered how the humans would react to meeting an elf commander and her dragon for the first time. She had a feeling it would be interesting. The humans had just finished eating their evening meal when Thornax descended from the darkening sky with his wings spread wide and his scales catching the last light of the setting sun. To Commander Lyria's surprise, the humans did not scatter in panic or reach for their weapons, and instead 20 pairs of eyes turned upward in unison and tracked the dragon flight path with what looked like excitement rather than fear. Maya Bennett voice carried clearly over the communication channel that Lyria was monitoring, and she said with enthusiasm that there was a real dragon in the Skylorn. Hayes was already pulling out her scanner, and she said correction, and that was a real dragon, and the biochemistry suggested silicon-based tissues and temperature regulation via controlled combustion. And then she said, "Oh my God, it was beautiful." Thornax landed 30 meters from their camp with enough force to shake the ground and spread its wings in a display that had sent enemy battalions fleeing in terror, but the humans crowded forward to get a better look at him instead of running away. Thornax observed through their mental bond that these creatures were insane, but Lyria detected approval in his thoughts rather than concerned. Lyria herself descended from the shuttle on a gravitic platform that let her float down slowly, and her white armor gleamed in the firelight. and she wore her ceremonial blade at her hip because she had chosen her most impressive military regalia to establish authority, but the effect was somewhat diminished when Amber Collins immediately said that was the coolest entrance she had ever seen. Silaria began formally, and her voice carried the weight of her 300 years of life, and she said that she was Commander Lyria, Stormweaver of the Sentinel Corps, an observer for the Galactic Council, and she had been monitoring their survival trial on this world. Sophie Martinez said cheerfully that they knew, and she pointed at the sky and said, "They spotted Lyria's shuttle on day 2, because the thermal signature was pretty obvious." Lyria blinked in surprise and asked if they had detected her stealth vessel, and she thought it was invisible to primitive sensors. Rayleigh Thompson shrugged and said that stealth is relative and Lyria was good at hiding from electronic sensors, but the atmospheric disturbance from the shuttle engines created a predictable pattern, and it was basic thermodynamics for the first time in 300 years. Lyria felt off balance and confused. She had expected awe or fear, or at least respect for her dramatic entrance, but instead, the humans were treating her arrival like a friendly visit from neighbors. She told them that their performance on this Class 9 world had been unexpected because most species cannot survive here for even a single day. Mia said with a grin that most species probably had better survival instincts than humans, and they were kind of stubborn, that way Brooklyn Wells raised her hand like she was in a classroom and asked if Lyria Dragon breathed fire because the chemical processes required for that would be fascinating to Studi Thornax. Rumbled with amusement, and through their bond, Lyria felt his request, and she sighed, and said he would demonstrate if they promised not to run away. Amar Diaz asked why would they run, and she seemed genuinely confused by the idea when Thornax unleashed a column of blue-white flame into the night sky. The humans did not scream or flee, and instead they applauded, and several took photographs, and Lauren immediately began taking atmospheric readings to analyze the combustion. Byproducts. Lyria decided to abandon formality since it clearly was not working, and she said that the humans were the first she had ever seen treat a Class 9 world like a recreational outing, and she asked how they did it though. Humans exchanged glances with each other, and finally, Sophie spoke up and said with respect that this was not that bad, and it was like camping in Alaska meets hiking in Australia meets diving in the Mariana Trench, and it was challenging, sure, but Earth had trained them for worse. Lyria objected and said that Earth was not classified as a death world, according to Galactic standards. Maya said, maybe not by galactic standards, but humans had hurricanes that could level entire cities and earthquakes that cracked continents apart, and volcanoes that blocked out the sun and temperature ranges from -92 plus 70 Celsius, and more species that could kill humans than species that could not, and they evolved in that environment, so this planet was just camping with extra steps. Lyria felt the information settle over her like cold water, and she pulled up Earth's environmental data on her wrist computer and really examined it for the first time, and saw the temperature variations and the tectonic instability and the sheer diversity of hazards, and by galactic standards, Earth should have been classified as a Class 7 world minimum. She said slowly that humans were a death world species. Riley corrected her with a smile and said they preferred to think of themselves as really adaptably. Thornax approached the nearest cadets and lowered his massive head to eye level, and instead of recoiling in fear, Amber reached out slowly and let him catch her scent, then gently touched his scaled snout, and the dragon pleased rumble vibrated through the ground. Thornax declared through the mental bond that he liked these humans because they respected strength but did not fear it. Over the next hour, Lyria found herself sitting by their campfire. It's actually sitting on the ground by a fire, which was something she had not done since her youth, and the humans explained their training regimen to her, and they talked about desert survival and death, valley and cold weather operations in Antarctica and jungle, warfare schools in the Amazon, and underwater demolitions training, and high-altitude mountaineering. And each environment prepared them for the worst their galaxy might offer, Lauren explained while showing Lyria her botanical scans of local plants that they figured space would be dangerous, so they trained for everything they could think of, and Then trained some more Illyria, observed that humans spoke of danger like it was an old friend. Maya said it was more like a fact of life, and humans had been staring down extinction-level threats for thousands of years, including climate changes and diseases and wars and asteroid impacts and predators, and they were still here because they learned to adapt and improvise and never give up. And she grinned and added that they were also too stubborn to die. Quietly, Sophie added that the real secret was that humans looked out for each other, and alone they were tough, but together they were basically unstoppable. Illyria thought of her own people, the ancient elves who valued individual prowess and honor, and they were mighty warriors, but they had never developed the same pack loyalty she saw in these young humans, and perhaps that was why the first contact wars had cost her people so dearly until the Treaty of Stars was signed. Said quietly that the Galactic Council sent her to determine if humanity deserved a place in the Sentinel Corps, which was made up of warriors who protected the weak and patrolled the dangerous frontiers and stood against the darkness between stars. Harper asked what Lyria's assessment was going to be. Lyria looked around the camp at the improvised shelters and the carefully organized supplies and the humans who had turned a death sentence into a camping trip, and she met Thornack's eyes and felt his agreement through there. She said slowly that she thought the galaxy had no idea what it was about to gain, but first, the humans had 5 more days of their trial left, and she wanted them to show her what else humans could do. Maya's grin was fierce, and she said that they were just getting started. In the distance, something roared, and it was one of Kervac 7. True apex predators, and the sound would send most species running for their lives, but the humans merely checked their gear and started planning how to deal with it. Lyria could not help but smile because for the first time in centuries of warfare, she felt something she had almost forgotten, and it was hope for a better future. That night, Lyria slept in the human camp with Thornax curled protectively nearby, and she dreamed of a galaxy where humans and elves and dragons worked together to protect the innocent and fight against evil. And when she woke in the morning, she knew the dream would become reality. The humans had already proven themselves worthy, and the next 5 days would only confirm what she already knew in her heart. Day 7 brought the crisis that Commander Lyria had been dreading since she first arrived on Kervac 7. The orbital sensors detected it first, and it was a migration pattern that should not have been happening this season, and thousands of creatures were moving in concert and flowing across the continent like a living wave of death, and the computers identified them immediately as void-spawned swarms. Lyria blood turned ice cold because she had seen swarms consume entire colonies and strip planets of all life and leave nothing but bones and ash behind them, and they were the reason
X7
had been abandoned by the previous inhabitants, and the reason it remained classified as unsurvivable. And the swarms emerged from the deep caves every 50 years to feed, but according to the planetary cycle data, they were not due for another decade. The humans' extraction point lay directly in the swarm. Pathloria immediately ordered her crew to begin emergency extraction procedures and said all cadets needed immediate recall, and this was not a drill anymore. But when she opened a communication channel to the human camp, Maya Bennett's face appeared on the screen, and she was calm despite the gravity sensor readings that Lyria knew they could see. And Maya thanked her for the heads up and said they were tracking the movement, and asked how much time they had. Lyria said with urgency that Maya did not understand, and these were void spawn, and they numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and no military force had ever successfully defended against a swarm this size, and the humans needed to evacuate. Immediately, Sophie Martinez appeared beside Maya and said with respect that they had 48 hours before the swarm reached their position, and that was enough time. Illyria's composure cracked, and she asked enough time for what, and was it to die gloriously, because she had seen what swarms did, and they were not individual creatures that could be outwitted, and they were a collective consciousness that adapted and learned and devoured everything, and she pleaded with them to let her extract them. The humans exchanged looks with each other, and then Lauren Hayes stepped into view holding a datapad and asked permission to share their screen. Suddenly, Lyria display filled with tactical data and movement projections and terrain analysis and something that looked suspiciously like a battle plan, and it was a very comprehensive battle plan, Lauren explained, while highlighting sections of her analysis that they had been mapping the swarm behavior patterns since they detected seismic anomalies on day 5. The creatures were following underground river systems, which meant their route was predictable and they avoided extreme heat and electromagnetic interference, and according to biological samples collected from scout organisms, they had a hierarchical communication structure. Lyria asked in disbelief if the humans had been studying the swarm. Riley Thompson said, with a shrug, that science division had to do science, and besides, they figured if something was going to try to kill them, they should at least understand how it worked. Amber Collins took over the presentation and said here was what they were proposing, and they could not stop the swarm, but they could redirect it, and there was a volcanic rift system 20 kilometers south. And if they created enough heat and electromagnetic interference along a specific channel she traced on the map, they could guide the swarm away from their extraction point and into the rift system where the extreme temperatures should discourage the creatures from emerging. Lyria stared at the plan and said that would require explosives and coordinated timing across 12 kilometers, and someone would need to stay behind to trigger the final charges. Brooklyn Wells reported that they had engineering expertise and enough salvaged fuel cells to make shaped charges, and coordinated timing was easy because they all trained in synchronized operations. And as for staying behind, she glanced at her companions and said they all volunteered because nobody gets left. Alon Thornax stirred in Lyria's mind and asked if the young humans planned to fight. Lyria corrected him absently, while still examining the tactical plan, and said they were not young, and they were something else entirely. She knew she should order them to evacuate, cause it was the sensible choice and the safe choice. But Lyria had been a warrior for 3 centuries, and she recognized something in these humans that she rarely saw even among her own kind. And they were not planning to fight out of desperation or suicidal bravery, but they had assessed the threat and calculated a solution, and were now calmly preparing to execute a complex military operation against overwhelming odds. They were thinking like true sentinels. Lyria announced that she was coming down to the surface, and if they were going to attempt this madness, they would need someone with actual military experience and heavy fire support. And she glanced back at Thornax and said they were joining the Human War Council. The dragon approval radiated through their bond, and he said finally, when Lyria and Thornax arrived at the human camp, she found organized chaos everywhere, and the cadets had divided into specialized teams for engineering and reconnaissance and combat and medical support, and each team was working on different aspects of the operation, and maps covered every surface marked with timing sequences and fallback positions and contingency plans. Maya greeted her and gestured to their command center, which was an impressively detailed holographic projection cobbled together from their personal devices, and she welcomed Lyria to Operation Roadblock and said they could use her expertise on void spawn behavior patterns because their data was limited to this region. For the next 6 hours, Lyria worked alongside the humans and contributed centuries of tactical knowledge to their plan, and she suggested improvements to their explosive placement based on swarm reaction times, and Thornax provided aerial reconnaissance and mapped the terrain from above with his keen dragon senses. What amazed Lyria most was how efficiently the humans incorporated her input, and they did not treat her as a superior officer to be obeyed without question, and they did not dismiss her experience either, and they collaborated and debated and refined and adapted their plan in real time. During a brief rest period, Lyria asked Maya if this was how humans fought. Maya corrected her and said this was how humans survived and back on Earth. They learned a long time ago that the lone warrior dies quickly, but a team that trusts each other and communicates well and adapts to new situations can take on anything. Sophie added that humans had something the swarm did not have, and that was creativity, because the swarm was a collective consciousness, which meant they were really good at doing the same thing millions of times, but they struggled with novel situations. So the humans were going to give them the most novel situation they could create. As night fell, Lyria found herself standing watch with Harper Diaz, while the others rested, and the young cadet was maintaining the perimeter sensors, and her movements were efficient and practiced. Harper asked quietly if she could ask Lyria something, and wanted to know why the commander really came down to the surface, because she could have just extracted the humans and reported to the Galactic Council that they failed. Lyria considered the question carefully and said that she needed to understand what made humans different, because her people, the Elvenor, were ancient and proud, and they had been among the stars for thousands of years. But when they encountered challenges like this, they responded with overwhelming force or tactical retreat. But humans responded with creativity and adaptation, and something she could only describe as determined optimism. And humans saw impossible odds and immediately started calculating how to make them merely difficult. Harper asked if that was a good thing or a bad thing, or admitted she did not know yet. But she was beginning to think it might be exactly what the galaxy needed. In the distance, the seismic sensors detected the swarm approach, and they had 36 hours till contact and 36 hours to pull off a military operation that by all conventional wisdom should fail. Spectacular Lyria looked at Thornax, and then at the sleeping humans, and then at the tactical maps spread everywhere. Key murmured that they were really doing this. Harper grinned and said, "Welcome to the human way, Commander, and now they should go teach some bugs why they should not mess with Earth cadets for the first time in decades." Lyria felt the thrill of true battle anticipation, and it was not fear but excitement, and these humans were either going to pull off a miracle, or they would all die together trying either way. It would be legendary, and songs would be sung about this day. The void-spawn swarm arrived like a living nightmare from the depths of the planet Commander. Lyria stood on the ridge overlooking the kill zone with Thornax beside her, and watched as the horizon turned black with movement, and hundreds of thousands of creatures flowed across the landscape, and each one was the size of a large dog with armor plating and mandibles that could cut through steel, and they moved like water, consuming everything in their path. The humans had nicknamed them crawlers, which seemed almost disrespectful given their terrifying nature, but Lyria was beginning to understand that humans dealt with fear through casual irreverence, and Humor Brooklyn Wells reported over the communication system that charges were set, and all 12 stations were ready for ignition on Lyria. Lyria had initially objected to being given tactical command because these were human cadets, and she was technically just an observer, but Maya had insisted and said that Lyria had the experience and they had the skills, and together they had a chance. The swarm reached the first waypoint, and Lyria checked her tactical display and watched as the creatures followed the predicted path exactly as Lauren models had projected, and the young scientist analysis had been flawless. Lyria ordered Station 1 to ignite. The first explosion created a wall of fire across the swarm northern flank, and the creatures recoiled, and their collective consciousness registered the danger, and as predicted, they began to shift southward, away from the hit. Lyria ordered Station 2 to ignite, and told Station 3 to stand by. The operation unfolded like a deadly dance, and each explosion guided the swarm a little further toward the volcanic rift system and herded them away from the extraction point through carefully controlled bursts of fire and electromagnetic interference, and the humans had positioned each charge with mathematical precision and created a corridor of acceptable retreat for the swarm. Then inevitably something went wrong. Sophie voice came through the communication channel, and she sounded strained and said they had a problem because Station 7 remote trigger was not responding, and the charge needed to be manually detonated or the swarm would break through their corridor. Lyria pulled up the map and saw that Station 7 was directly in the swarm path, and anyone who went there now would be overrun within minutes. Samber Collins reported from Station 6 that she was closest and could make it in 90 seconds. Lyria said negative immediately because the swarm would reach that position in 60 seconds, and Amber could not make it in time. Amber interrupted and said, "Watch me," and she was already running through the orbital cameras. Lyria watched as the young cadet sprinted across treacherous terrain, and her movements were graceful despite the heavy equipment she carried, and the leading edge of the swarm was a black wave closing in behind. Her 40 seconds passed, and Amber reached the charge and began the manual ignition. Sequence 30 seconds remained, and the swarm was close enough that Lyria could see individual creatures breaking away from the mass, and they were drawn by amber. Movement and heat signature 20 seconds. Maya shouted over the communication. Channel for Amber to leave it and get out of there, Amber. God. Voice was tight with concentration, and she said she was almost there. 10 seconds, and the swarm was upon her then. Thornax moved the dragon, launched from the ridge with a roar that shook the mountains, and dove toward station 7 with his wings folded for maximum speed, and Lyria felt his determination through their bond. And he would not watch the brave young human to Thornax hit the ground like a meteor between Amber and the swarm and spread his wings to create a physical barrier, and blue-white flames erupted from his mouth in a continuous stream and created a wall of fire that even the void spawn would not cross. Amber yelled that the charge was set and told Thornax to go. The dragon scooped the cadet onto his back with surprising gentleness and launched skyward. Just as the charge detonated and the explosion channeled the swarm exactly as planned, but the force of it caught Thornax's tail and sent him into a spiraling descent. Lyria screamed through their bond and felt his pain and disorientation. The dragon fought for control and protected Amber with his body as they crashed into the forest canopy 200 meters from the kill zone, and through their bond Lyria felt him, and he was alive and injured, but alive. She was already running before she realized she had moved, and her centuries of combat training took over, and the fastest route to Thornax led directly through the edge of the swarm territory and through terrain that would kill most beings, but she did not care. But she was not alone. Maya voice cut through the chaos with absolute authority and ordered all units to converge on Thornax's position, because nobody gets left behind. 20 human cadets moved as one and abandoned their defensive positions to mount a rescue operation for a dragon they had met only days ago, and they used everything they had learned on this Deathworld and Sophie knowledge of safe paths, and Riley improvised shields from salvaged materials and Lauren repellent compounds that confused the swarm chemical sensors. They fought their way through the chaos like a single organism and protected each other and adapted to threats in real time and turned obstacles into opportunities and win. Harper was caught by a crawler. Brooklyn was there with an improvised electrical discharge that fried its neural system, and when the terrain became too dangerous, Amber and Maya created a rope system that let them traverse the hazards safely. Lyria reached Thornax first and slid down a rocky slope with her blade drawn and ready to defend him with her life, but when she arrived, she found the humans had beaten her there, and they had formed a defensive perimeter around the injured dragon and were fighting off the scattered swarm elements that had been drawn to the crash site. Lauren reported while running a scanner over Thornax's wing that he was okay and had a sprained joint and some bruising, but nothing broken, and he would fly again in a few days. Thornax rumbled weakly and through their bond. Lyria felt his message, and he said the small human was safe, and that was what mattered. Lyria whispered while pressing her forehead against his scaled snout that he was a magnificent idiot and a brave, wonderful fool. Maya called from the perimeter and said she hated to interrupt the reunion, but they had incoming because the main swarm was almost to the rift system, but some splinter groups were circling back. Lyria straightened and wiped her eyes, because later she would examine the unfamiliar sensation of tears, but right now they had work to finish. She said they would finish this properly and drew her blade, and the weapon hummed to life with ancient elf technology, meeting modern determination, and she said, for Thornax and for humanity and for the future of the Sentinel Corps, the humans' answering battle cry was enthusiastic and slightly off-key, but it was the most beautiful sound Lyria had ever heard, together with an elf commander and an injured dragon and 20 possible humans. They held the line against the swarm by the time the rescue shuttle arrived at the extraction point. 3 hours later, the void spawn swarm had been successfully diverted into the rift system, and all the humans had survived with only minor injuries, and Lyria had composed her report. To the Galactic Council, it was the shortest recommendation she had ever written, and it said approve humanity for the Sentinel Corps immediately, and if possible, recruit these specific cadets. An explanation was attached. The explanation ran to 300 pages and included phrases like redefines tactical possibility and unprecedented adaptability and saved a dragon. While setting fire to a death world as the shuttle climbed toward orbit, Lyria sat beside Thornax in the cargo bay while the humans celebrated their survival with songs that made absolutely no sense but somehow felt appropriate, and Sophie was teaching Amber a drinking song, despite the fact that they had no alcohol, and Riley was already writing up the mission report with commentary like, and then we totally improvised the part where everything exploded. Maya caught Lyria's eye and grinned, and asked if the commander thought they passed the test. Lyria looked at the young woman who had led 20 cadets through hell and turned it into a camping trip with explosions, and she thought about their creativity and their loyalty and their ability to find hope in impossible situations. She said quietly that they did not just pass, but they changed the rules entirely through the viewport Curvac 7. Receded into the distance, and it was a scarred world that had tried and failed to break humanity's spirit, and in a way, it was a perfect metaphor for what was about to happen to the galaxy. Thorn X rumbled in her mind and asked when they would get to train with the humans proper. Lilaria promised soon, and very soon, while watching as Lauren excitedly explained her botanical discoveries to an amused Brooklyn. The Sentinel Corps was about to gain its most unusual members, and the galaxy, whether it knew it or not, was about to become a much safer place, or possibly a much more interesting one with humans. Lyria was learning those two things were often the same, and she smiled, because the future was bright and full of possibilities, and she was honored to be part of it.